Hey, all right. Welcome everybody. I'm kind of trying to do this as a SO320 class to give you a bit of a grounding in sociological theory. Bear with me as I kind of get used to the software, which I've never used before, Wirecast live streaming. But what I hope is that you can chat here. If anybody is able to join me, you see you can go down here and I'll say hi in the chat window there. And if you have any questions as I go along, please do not hesitate to let me know what they are. So if you will recall from the last time that we were together, I was talking a little bit just about the sort of the generalities of sociological theory and how we might classify different sociological theories and trying to put them along these two different axes. Again, it's not, you don't have to fetishize these or the way that they do it in the book, and I may even reverse it on the board just now. I'm not working from notes right now too much. I'm just working mostly off the top of my head, but what you'll see here is that we have at least two ways to group or to organize sociological theory. One way being along the dimension of how they theorize the social order, and that is whether they view the social order as necessarily being a collective, or whether they view it as what we would call a concatenation of individuals. Another way that we put it is does society exist as an entity sui generis, right? In the first instance, is society a big thing that sort of pre-exists individuals? It exists after them, it exists before any individual comes into the scene, into society, or is society constantly sort of rebuilt, renewed every day in just sort of interactions between individuals? The sort of the popular version or a popular version of this was rendered by the Prime Minister of England, Margaret Thatcher, said at one point, there's no such thing as society. And of course, most sociologists don't believe that, but they do rather believe that there is such a thing as society, and that is where we view there being this collective there. So again, I may be sort of reversing the ordering in the textbook, but again, it doesn't really matter. The question here is, does a particular theory understand society as a collective, or does it look at society as a grouping of individuals? And another way to sort of group theory is by, can you see that? Yeah, you can more or less see that. Is to consider whether we understand sociological or social action as a rational, and this is the, I'm sorry, this is the notion of action here. Is it rational or, now the second term in this is always a little bit more nebulous, but we could say non-rational or irrational, depending on who's talking about it. And when we say rational, we mean, does this appeal to a means ends calculus? Or are we appealing to some, I don't know, higher isn't necessarily the best way to put it, but appealing to some higher value when we make decisions? So what this is to say, it may be better to sort of think about with a sort of a concrete example in mind. And so going from the rational to the non-rational. And of course, maybe not of course, and by the way, you can look at the same action, you can look at the same group of people, you can look at the same things using these different understandings. So one version of this or one example of this could be altruism. So we could look at altruism like, let's see, giving alms. Giving alms. That's a weird word, isn't it? Alms. Giving alms. Okay. If viewed as a non-rational action, we could say that giving alms is about sort of doing an action that is valued by your community because it's something that your community has always done. You know, if you're a Catholic and you practice tithing and giving alms as part of your tithing, you're doing it because you're appealing to some higher value, not because you specifically are hoping to sort of add up chits to get a better chance at going to heaven. No, you're just doing it because that's the right thing to do. So that would be a non-rational version of this, or way of understanding giving alms. A rational understanding of giving alms is sort of alms as calculated for warm, fuzzy feelings. Fuzzy feelings. Now again, you might step back and say, well, but aren't the origins of warm, fuzzy feelings themselves non-rational? And I would say, yeah, probably sure. Okay, fine. Let's just bracket that for a second, though. One way to view giving alms is that you're making a cost-benefit analysis, essentially. Right? This is the kind of calculus that underlies what we call rational activity. So you got $5. And you have a choice of things to do with those $5. You could, I don't know, buy a slice of pizza. You could, order a video on Netflix. I don't know, whatever it is you want to do with $5. You could do, and you'd get some quantity of happiness out of that. On the other hand, you give that $5 to a homeless person, or you send $5 to the American Red Cross, and that gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling inside. And if that warm, fuzzy feeling is worth more than whatever you could have done otherwise with the $5, then we say that is a rational action. And the question is, depending on the different sociological theories that you'll see, we find different sociological theories that really do look at the world in these ways, it will determine whether that theory or that theorist is looking at action as being rational versus non-rational. So again, this is sort of a very general schematic that outlines how we can think about different sociological theories or theorists. I'm not gonna try to throw examples at you too much right at the moment, but we will work as we talk about different sociological theorists to see where do they fit. And in fact, we'll find sometimes, for example, Weber is kind of really a good example of somebody who operates in different places who understands different societies or different groups over time or in different places as having different motivations. So Weber can very much, sort of look at pre-modern Europe as a place that was obsessed with sort of non-rational motivations behind actions, and then modern Europe as being some place that was a society in which people were highly motivated by rational modes of thinking, by making rational actions. Okay, so that's again, the two kind of key ways of discussing sociological theories that your text exposes you to, and that you will find in different forms in different theories. And it's just, like I think I said before, it's a good accounting technique. It's a good way to kind of think about one group of theories versus another to understand really what sets them apart from one another. A couple of other things I'm going to want you to bear in mind as you, how do I put it, as you look at different sociological theories, compare and contrast sociological theories, try to understand the differences between them. One key dimension here is, let's see how much, okay, so structure versus agency. And this is a really interesting, get out of your way. Okay, structure versus agency. This is a really interesting debate within the social sciences in general, within sociological theory in specific. The question here really is, and it's related, I think, both to the question of the social order and to the question of action. The question is essentially whether people's actions are determined by the social structure. So we'd say social structure sort of as determinate, or whether they're able to exercise what we call agency. And here, I think I mentioned on the first day, right? We're gonna use a lot of concepts in this class that you've heard in different contexts that mean something totally different, right? So agency, you've heard in the context of like an insurance agency or something like that, or the Central Intelligence Agency, and you think about agents in that sense, similar but different than what sociologists are getting at with this term. So when sociologists say agency, or we will use the term agent, what we basically mean is free will. Are you able to make decisions on your own? Do you have any true freedom in making the choices that you made in life? And so the example now, if we were in a classroom where you were in front of me physically, let me check here, see that in the chat window if anybody's been able to find this yet. And hey, Lex, you're here, you made it, good. Okay, cool. So agency is how much power we have over our role in society. Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. Power over your role in society, or even really to more mundane dimensions of everyday life. So it's like, do you want a bagel for breakfast, or do you want Captain Crunch? And some really extreme versions of sociological theory would say that your choice of Captain Crunch is not really a freely made choice, but is determined by the sort of capitalist, agro-industrial complex, the media complex that shows you Captain Crunch. Actually, I can't remember the last time I saw a Captain Crunch commercial, but You know, as I recall, he was, you know, a very inspiring pirate. You know, by having those images, by pushing them into your brain, though you think you freely chose to have Captain Crunch because it's tastier than the bagel or it's less time consuming or whatever it is, you actually chose Captain Crunch because society determined that that would be the best choice for you on this morning. That's a very mundane example. The one I usually give in a classroom situation is going to college, right? And you think like, oh, you got to make a choice of going to college, but really, did you really decide to go to college? You know, or is it really determined for you because of the kind of social class that you exist in within society, or because of the opportunity structure that exists within society that determines that alternative options are not maybe so great for you? And even, you know, is the choice of Eckerd College versus FSU or something a more or less determinate choice based upon various aspects of your social background? And what we will find again is that, you know, this is something of a continuum where in certain situations you'll see sociologists who really see everything as very highly structured. I would say the Marxists tend to fall in that camp versus theorists who really put an emphasis on agency, put an emphasis on individual decision making. So again, we'll look at these in much more specific detail, but I would say Marxists emphasize structure, for example, in what we call rational choice theory, and that is represented by people like Homans, who will read way at the end of the, is it the right direction? I can't tell. This is all flipped when I look at the red thing, so like my hands go in the wrong direction. I don't know. At the very end of the course, it's either over there or over there, depending on how you think of the course right now, we'll look at this rational choice theory, which puts a lot more emphasis upon individual agency, upon individuals making choices for themselves based on a pretty complete set of information and not being determined for them by the social structure. And just one more note here, that we will not see too much of this in the scope of this particular course, because I haven't found somebody really, it's really about like me not finding great writing on this yet that I think I should be exposing you to, but I want you to have a sense of it, and if you're interested, come see me, send me a message at some point, and I'll turn you on to some readings in this direction. We are increasingly sociologists playing a little bit more nicely with, I don't want to say psychologists, some psychologists, but really cognitive biology. And one way of thinking about structure, there's certainly the big S social structure, but there is a little s structure here as well that is within the individual, inside your brains. And there's a lot of debate going on right now in sociology as to how much that brain structure really constricts the kind of decisions that you can make. There's very little, I would say, in the way of settled science on these questions, but it is something that's incredibly intriguing to sociologists at this point, and it's not going away anytime soon. You know, we're going to continue to confront this question of how much we are constrained by our brain structure, by our brain chemistry. And it appears that certain decisions, even just at the most mundane level, this idea of gaining pleasure from things. We know that there are pleasure centers in the brain. We know that there are a couple of chemicals, dopamine and the other chemical I can't remember, that make you happy. There is definitely brain chemistry underlying actions. The question is how much brain chemistry determines our actions, and the sort of the next step beyond that, and we'll see something like a version of this when we talk a bit more about culture, is how much culture really shapes the brain. So yes, we can have these structures within the brain that respond to certain stimuli in certain ways, or that kind of push us to seek satisfaction for various appetites, but sociology is really here to say what is counted as satisfying those appetites is a social thing. I think we're going to still hold on to that for a long time. Let me just check this here. Okay, yes, mind control, Lex. Yes, pretty much. And okay, so I did want to as well get started with talking about Karl Marx. And I think the way to do that is really just to trace some of these key concepts in Marx. So what I will start with here is historical materialism. And this is really, again, this is out of all the concepts in sociological theory, at least in my experience of teaching this course, the one where the popular definition gets mixed up with the sociological definition. So, materialism, and specifically, I guess I kind of put it in parentheses. I put the historical in parentheses, materialism as the sort of main part of the concept here. When we talk about materialism with respect to Marx, we are not, not exactly. We're not exactly not, but we certainly aren't are. That's a horrible way to put it. Anyway, we're not saying that people merely love stuff. There is something like that in Marx we'll get to called commodity fetishism. But really, materialism is a way of looking at societies. Just a second. So, when we talk about materialism in Marx, this goes to what has often been called the base superstructure model of society. And this is, by the way, you're going to be sort of overwhelmed with metaphors throughout the course, so hold on to your hat and try to keep your metaphors straight, and I'll try not to mix my metaphors. Okay, so here we have the base, or you can think of it as the foundation, and here we have the superstructure. The metaphor here being one of building construction. So the base is like the foundation, the superstructure is like the house or the office building. And what Marx is saying, and this is historical materialism, he's saying that the base is economics, or he'll call it different things in different places in the reading, but if you go back to that first reading on the German ideology, he makes it pretty clear. He's like, this is like real life conditions. Doing stuff, making stuff, bleeding and working and breathing and eating and all your sort of, well, he doesn't want to just say animal life, but the stuff that's really close to that, where you're actually engaging your body in work and you're engaging in actually making changes to the world. That is the base of society. That's what determines change. That's what determines how the world is experienced. And all the rest of society is a superstructure built on top of that. So within that superstructure, is what he calls civil society, by which I generally read politics, as well as that big C word that we use in many ways, the culture, by which, again, we could understand things like religion, language, arts, really anything meaningful. And in the German ideology, Marx makes this statement. Oh, where does he make this statement? See, I ought to have it. I ought to have it in front of me. But it's somewhere around page 42. He says that, whereas the German philosophers descend from heaven to the earth, materialism ascends from earth to heaven. And what he means by that is, is just this base superstructure model, that economics and that real life conditions are the basis of all this stuff. Where he's saying that the German ideologists descend from heaven to the earth, he's really saying that, you have these sort of they'll use the word highfalutin a few times in our readings. These highfalutin ideas, these ideas of religion in particular, right? As you probably know, right, from reading your manifesto in freshman year, right? He'll say again that religion is an opium of the people. I guess that was today's reading as well, if you're keeping up, right? So when religion says something like, "Thou shalt not kill," or "Thou shalt not," "covet thy neighbor's wife." Remember this 10 Commandments, Moses, okay? "Shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife." Thy neighbor's wife. If you're descending from heaven to the earth, you think that these are just transcendent statements from the heavens that order how people conduct their lives. Or even, I like to talk about how Howard Zinn, who is a Marxist historian, liked to look at the history of the United States, right? And again, I don't want to oversell this stuff. I'm saying this is how Marxists think about the world. I'm not necessarily saying this is how the world is. Okay, so just keep that caveat there, because I want you to, I do want you to have the freedom to question all this stuff. But right now, let's just try to get the Marx or the Marxists, like Howard Zinn is a Marxist, right? And what Howard Zinn would point to, and Marx himself pointed to this a little bit as well, saying things like, in the time of the American Revolution, right, we had all these statements like, gosh, now I'm losing it here. All men are created equal. There you go. All men are created equal. Which was, a revolutionary concept at the time. Because back in the days, compared to the king was obviously not created very equal to everybody else. He clipped his nails, he smelled okay, he had a huge palace, horses, etc. Clearly, he had some divinity about him, right? Well, the revolutionaries come along and they say, oh no, all men are created equal. Or Moses goes up on the mountain, he gets these big rocks. Sorry, I always think of it. You remember Mel Brooks? Of course you don't remember Mel Brooks, but I'll just rant for a minute. So in the history of the world, Mel Brooks goes up as Moses onto the mountain, and he comes, and he's got 15 commandments, and he comes down from the mountain with these commandments from God, and he drops one of the tablets, and he's like, I have these 15! Oops! These 10 commandments! Which actually, this kind of fits well with Marx, because Marx is saying this is sort of an arbitrary thing. These aren't really from God. These are really from the material conditions in which men live, right? Why is it bad to kill people? There is nothing, I don't know, that makes me sound bad. We could, from Marx's point of view, we might say there's nothing objectively bad about killing people, except economics does not work very well if you kill people off, right? Your community is a valued asset. And if you start killing people off who live in your town, right, when it comes to like sheep farming or whatever was going on back there in the early Mosaic era, the way of life would not have been very sustainable if there was not some philosophy propping things up to say, don't kill people. Marx is saying that really comes out of the real life conditions. We really need a lot of people around to do farming. But we come up with this statement like, thou shalt not kill, to sort of remind everybody about that, to keep the economic situation flowing nicely. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, because, questions of lineage become very important. If you go back and read your Old Testament, you'll see there is so much talk about, like, the number of sheep and goats and whatever Old Testament dudes had on their farms. And they passed it on to their sons. And there's all these stories about how fraught those decisions were. Well, if you didn't know who your kid was in the first place, you're talking big messes, right? Really playing hell with the economic conditions. So, don't go coveting thy neighbor's wife. Make sure we know who the lineage of all the kids are, and so on and so forth. And fast forwarding a good 2,500, 3,000 years, you come to the merchant class of the American colonies living under the mercantile system, right? And these guys are now accumulating quite a bit of wealth for themselves. Guys like Franklin, who sort of got himself a little printing empire going on. Guys like Jefferson, running a big plantation in Monticello. Washington running Mount Vernon. Paul Revere being a silversmith. Think of all the important men of the American Revolutionary era, and what you quickly come to realize is that they're all members of, if not the merchant class, then of the class of wealthy Southern landowners. And it's very much in their economic interests to now say, you know what, all men are created equal. We are not going to continue to pay taxes to this king over there in England. We're going to say, no, all men are created equal, and that will prop up the capitalist economic conditions that they wish to see dominating in the colonies. Okay, let me take a moment here and go to the next big concept. So let me check the chat screen for a second, and it's still you, Lex. Hi. Okay. So the mode of production. I don't think I'll go too deeply into this today. It's actually quite closely related to this base superstructure idea, but it also is sort of another way into historical materialism. And he traces this in a couple of your readings. Probably most pointedly in the German ideology. So he says that the mode of production consists in the means of production as well as the social relations of production. And that entire history that he gives in the German ideology, he gives it again in the manifesto, he gives it in several, in any number of his writings, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, blah, blah, blah. He says, if you're going to look at history, and he knows he's oversimplifying, but he says, if you're going to look at history, it should be looked at, in a good materialistic frame as a progression through different modes of production. If we look at, just again to take a couple, if we look at the feudal era, so the feudal mode of production consists of production by, I guess we'll call them artisans. So these would be artisans in the city, like blacksmiths and silversmiths and cabinet makers and so on and so forth. And the social relations of production are organized in guilds with apprentices and masters and journeymen. All right, just going back and reading this recently, it's like he really sees the state of being a journeyman as almost a state of being enslaved to the system of feudalism, but that's really how he understands that particular historical epoch. He says, to get things made, they were made through artisanal production. I don't know if you'll recall, like there's a bit of talk about like the Florentine guilds during Professor Skinner's art lectures earlier in your education here, right? Freshman year, he likes to talk about Renaissance Florence, and much of the city during the Renaissance was based upon these artisanal relations of production. You can actually see on these doors in Florence illustrations of, like I said, the blacksmiths or the silversmiths or the coopers or the ox handlers or whoever they are have their own sort of occupations enshrined on this door. That's where all the big money for projects was coming in the Quattrocento and the Cinquecento in Italy. That was the economic relation of production, because that was how production was happening. That was the means of production. And the social relations, right, were relations between the master craftsmen and their apprentices and their journeymen, who were really, sort of held in, I don't want to say contempt, but held in much lower positions, because they did not yet have a sort of a master workshop of their own. That's just one of these modes of production that comes to flourish in the European Renaissance. And fast forwarding, if we look at capitalism, the means of production lie in the factory. And I'm kind of fast forwarding here a little bit, but bear with me. The social relations of production increasingly, and again, we have to sort of consider that Marx is on a certain level oversimplifying to make this stuff understandable. It's not that he didn't himself understand that there's a lot of complexities going on in any of these societies. Obviously, during the Renaissance, there's much more than just artisanal production going on. He's well aware that during capitalist production, there's much more than factory production going on. But that is sort of the emblematic production that is occurring in society. And increasingly, and statistics bear this out for that matter, the social relations of production were being reduced to relations between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And these will be some other key terms for you, right? So if you don't already have them, right? Bourgeoisie and proletariat, these are keys to understanding what Marx is talking about. The bourgeoisie, very simply put, are the owners. They own the means of production. They own the factories. They own the trains that move things from one place to another. The proletariat are simply the workers. So again, what the owners own are factories, the raw materials, and here, we're talking about specifically or particularly mid-19th century England. So you can think about the stuff that they're making are things like textiles or steam locomotives or industrial quantities of food and beer and that sort of thing. So the owners own the factories, the raw materials. The workers own nothing but their labor. The workers own nothing but the labor. They own basically nothing but the shirts on their backs and the muscles in their arms and legs, and they're entirely dependent upon the bourgeoisie, because without the bourgeoisie, they have no access to their means of subsistence. Right? So they get paid by the bourgeoisie simply to reproduce their labor power. Now, let me pause for a moment and pull up another set of notes here so I know what the next set of key terms for you shall be. So, turning to the economic and philosophical manuscripts. This is good stuff. Okay, so when we get to the economic and philosophical manuscripts, we're continuing our focus now on the proletariat in particular. But when he turns to the question of alienation, Marx really wants us to understand that everybody is alienated. So, you'll see it, and it's really just an issue of translation. You'll see it in a couple of different ways. You'll see it either called estrangement or alienation. And in the productive process in capitalism, Marx theorizes that there are these several different ways in which we are alienated. So, first and foremost, we're alienated from the product of our labor. Maybe that's not foremost. It's first. I don't think it's foremost. We're alienated from the product of our labor. Which really means, and I wish you were all here. Like, this is something I like to talk about this stuff in more concrete terms. I guess this in and of itself is alienating, right? So here's my labor, right? Is talking and trying to turn minds onto important concepts. When it's working right, I can see people understanding things, and you can actually see the learning. Marx would be much more interested in a sort of very concrete example like cabinet making. So if you build a table or something like that, when an artisan does that, he can sort of see himself in the product of his labor. He can sort of take it in his hand and say, oh, this is where, I decided to use this kind of joint or this kind of wood, and, I know that, this particular piece of furniture is something that I made, right? I can recognize the product of my labor. And fundamentally, this is something that in any line of work, we theoretically could do. We could sort of see our own personal stamp in the product of our labor. But in capitalism, you really can't. It's especially engendered by the extreme division of labor. So, really, practically speaking, There's almost nobody who calls themselves like a cabinet maker anymore. There's a handful of, I'm sorry, I go off on the woodworking example because it's one near and dear to my heart. We could take, any number of different kinds of production and apply them to the same thing. You see the specialization? Yes, that does reach. I'm gonna turn our angle just a bit there. Get more whiteboard. Okay, so strictly speaking, today barely anybody, almost nobody calls themselves a cabinet maker. They work in a cabinet making factory. At best, they work in a cabinet shop, and they do one little bit of the job. It's like, oh, I'm the guy who puts the glue on the arms of the chairs, or I'm the guy who takes the piece of wood and sticks it into the shaping machine to make the legs. They don't even really see the legs as the product of their own labor because some machine does that. Right? They certainly don't see that table as the product of their labor because they only worked on an infinitesimal part of that table. That is not their table. They do not see that as the product of their labor. So they're alienated from it. They see it as literally something alien from themselves. They are alienated from the labor process. And concomitantly from themselves. This gets into a little bit of a sort of a quasi-metaphysical reflection on things, where Marx is saying here essentially that your labor processes should be more than a means to an end. You should be doing things that you really know are helping you to grow as a human being. But really, if you are, and I think, if any of you have worked jobs where you just absolutely turn your mind off, if you're working as a fry cook, if you're working as a, working in the service industry is a big one. If you work as a hostess, you make yourself someone other than who you really are in that moment, and you sort of turn your real self off, or you have an almost out-of-body experience. If you're working on a production line for 8 hours, you're not really thinking, you're not really present in the process of putting plastic widgets next to each other. You're somewhere else. You're not really being yourself. And Marx is saying that's an alienation. That's an alienation from yourself. You're making yourself alien to yourself. You're alienated from what he calls the species being. And this is, again, a sort of almost metaphysical concept that Marx is dealing with. He's saying that as a species, human beings are supposed to produce for the species. We don't just make things for ourselves, but we make things, we go out into the woods and hunt in groups for the advancement of the community, that kind of a thing, toward the advancement of human beings as a species. But he's saying, and again, especially with the division of labor, we lose that. We lose this sense that we're all in this together, that we're all working for each other, or really, for the species as a whole. And then, that is especially obvious in the degree of competition that we have between the workers in even just a factory, right? You can see that they are not working for each other, but really each for themselves. And that then goes to the fourth and final form of alienation, and that is the alienation from fellow human beings. So not only are we alienated from ourselves, not only are we alienated from the stuff that we're working on, we are alienated from the guy next to you on the line. You know, just think of almost any workplace you've ever been in. You know, yes, maybe some of those people are your friend. I hope some of those people are your friends. But also at the same time, they're in competition with you. You know, an awful thing that you'll find at work, and I'm sure many of you have found at work, is that some of those people who you think are your friends aren't your friends. Or you know, when it comes down to it in the working situation, you know, somebody who you thought would have your back does not have your back. And Marx is saying, you know, that's not necessarily really, you know, if we go back to the structure agency thing, this is not really a rational decision. Well, or maybe it is a rational decision in the sense that they might stab you in the back, right? That, you know, if you're a busboy and the waitress doesn't tip out to you adequately, you might feel like you're getting stabbed in the back. But Marx would say that's just an outcome of the system. The system is forcing these employees to each work for no one but themselves. And this is finally, you know, the way I've described this all makes it sound like it is especially problematic or maybe only relevant to the proletariat, to the workers in the factory, but really Marx wants us to see that this is problematic for everyone in society. This is problematic as much for the capitalist as for the workers, and those capitalists themselves, you know, face extreme sort of deprivations of fellow human spirit, which they might be granted in, and we'll talk about this next time, the communist utopia that Marx hopes for people. Okay, so I am going to leave it at that today. I hope it was, yeah, exactly. We're losing personality in our work. I hope I'm not making you too depressed here. I hope, what my hope is to run a lecture at our normally scheduled time on Friday at 9:30. And so keep up with the Keeping It Real and the discussion questions. And yeah, we'll be back in our real classroom on Monday. So thank you, Lex, for turning out. And anybody who's watching this as a recording, thank you for doing so. You can leave me feedback and tell me whether this is worthwhile or what I can do to improve. So thank you, and have a good trip back home to